What do you say to a five-star general who asks you to resurrect the career of the most brilliant, most dangerous, and most politically toxic commander in American military history? This was the impossible question facing Harry S. Truman in the spring of 1945, when Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, sent an urgent communique to Washington requesting the reinstatement of General George S. Patton Jr. to a position of significant authority in occupied Germany. Patton had just been relieved of his command of the Third Army on October 7, 1945, after a disastrous press conference in which he compared Nazi Party members to Republicans and Democrats, suggesting denazification was little more than political witch-hunting. The American press had crucified him, Congress demanded his head, and Truman, barely 6 months into an accidental presidency he never wanted, found himself caught between military necessity and political survival. Eisenhower's cable landed on Truman's desk like a hand grenade, and what the president said in response would define not just Patton's fate, but the very nature of civilian control over the military in post-war America. The tension between these three men, each representing different visions of American power, would play out against the backdrop of a devastated Europe, an emerging Cold War, and the question of whether genius could excuse recklessness in a democracy that had just fought a war to preserve its values. Before we dive deeper into this confrontation that shook the halls of power in Washington and shaped the post-war world, take a moment right now to subscribe to this channel, hit that like button, and share this story with someone who needs to understand how leadership decisions in moments of crisis define the course of history, and don't forget to leave a comment telling us what aspect of this story surprises you most, because your engagement helps us bring more forgotten moments of history to light. Now, to understand the explosive nature of Eisenhower's request and Truman's response, we must first comprehend who George Patton was and why his very existence presented such a profound dilemma for American leadership. Patton was born on November 11, 1885, into a family steeped in military tradition, a man who believed he had fought in previous lives at battles throughout history, who read military history in original Latin and Greek, and who commanded armored divisions with a combination of classical learning and modern brutality that made him simultaneously indispensable and impossible. During the invasion of Sicily in July 1943, Patton had slapped 2 soldiers suffering from what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, calling them cowards and threatening to shoot them, an incident that nearly ended his career until Eisenhower, recognizing that Patton's tactical genius was irreplaceable, covered for him and issued a private reprimand rather than a public court-martial. Eisenhower had saved Patton then because the invasion of Normandy and the race across France required commanders who could move with speed and aggression, qualities Patton possessed in abundance, and the Third Army's dash across France in the summer of 1944, covering more ground and capturing more enemy soldiers than any comparable force in military history, seemed to vindicate Eisenhower's faith in his most difficult subordinate. But Patton was never just a military problem. He was a political nightmare waiting to happen, a man whose mouth moved faster than his tanks and whose contempt for diplomacy was matched only by his brilliance in warfare. After the German surrender on May 8, 1945, when the shooting war ended and the political war began, Patton's usefulness started to decline while his capacity for disaster only increased. He openly advocated for rearming German units to fight the Soviet Union, a position that was strategic madness in the summer of 1945 when America and the USSR were still officially allies, and he administered occupied Bavaria with a leniency toward former Nazis that contradicted explicit American policy and inflamed public opinion back home. Eisenhower, now commanding all American forces in Europe from his headquarters in Frankfurt, watched with growing alarm as Patton's indiscretions piled up like casualties on a battlefield. The breaking point came on September 22, 1945, when Patton held a press conference in which he was asked about his slow pace of denazification in Bavaria, and instead of offering a diplomatic response, he launched into a tirade comparing Nazi party membership to American political party membership, suggesting that the distinction between Nazis and non-Nazis was meaningless and that treating former party members as criminals was hypocritical. The reporters in the room could hardly believe what they were hearing, and within hours, Patton's words were on front pages across America, sparking outrage from veterans groups, Jewish organizations, and politicians who demanded immediate action. Eisenhower was in an impossible position, caught between his loyalty to a subordinate who had helped win the war and his responsibility to maintain political order in occupied Germany and public confidence in military leadership back home. On October 7, 1945, Eisenhower summoned Patton to his headquarters and relieved him of command of the Third Army, reassigning him to the 15th Army, a largely paper organization tasked with writing the official history of the European campaign, a job that was essentially exile disguised as an assignment. Patton took the news like a physical blow, and though he maintained his composure in Eisenhower's office, those who saw him afterward reported that he looked like a man who had lost everything that gave his life meaning. For Patton, who defined himself entirely through command in war, this reassignment was a kind of death, and he knew it. Eisenhower, for his part, felt the weight of the decision, later writing that removing Patton was one of the most difficult things he had ever done, but he believed he had no choice given the political firestorm and the need to demonstrate that American occupation policy would be conducted according to democratic principles, not military expediency. But Eisenhower also understood something that civilian leaders in Washington did not fully appreciate, which was that the world emerging from the rubble of World War II was going to be far more dangerous than anyone anticipated, and that Patton's particular skills might yet be needed again. By early November 1945, the geopolitical landscape was shifting with alarming speed as the fragile alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union began to crack under the weight of competing visions for post-war Europe. Soviet forces occupied Eastern Europe from the Baltic to the Balkans, and Joseph Stalin showed no inclination to honor the promises he had made at Yalta in February 1945 regarding free elections and democratic governance in liberated territories. Eisenhower, whose headquarters received daily intelligence reports about Soviet activities in the eastern occupation zones, grew increasingly concerned that the United States had disarmed too quickly and too completely, reducing its forces in Europe from over 3 million men in May 1945 to fewer than 400,000 by November, while Soviet forces remained at full strength and showed no signs of demobilizing. In this context, Patton's earlier ravings about fighting the Soviets began to seem less like the paranoid fantasies of a warmonger and more like the prescient warnings of a strategic thinker who understood that the real struggle for Europe's future was just beginning. Eisenhower faced a terrible calculation as he surveyed his command in late 1945. He had enough forces to maintain basic occupation duties, but if tensions with the Soviets escalated into actual conflict, he would need commanders who could organize and lead American forces in rapid, mobile warfare against a numerically superior enemy, and there was simply no one in the American military better at that particular kind of warfare than George S. Patton, Jr. It was against this background that Eisenhower drafted his cable to Washington in late November 1945, requesting that Patton be given a new assignment that would utilize his talents and restore some measure of his authority in the European theater. Eisenhower's message to the War Department was carefully worded, acknowledging Patton's political liabilities while emphasizing his unique military capabilities and suggesting that in a rapidly deteriorating security environment, America could not afford to sideline its most effective combat commanders because of their inability to navigate post-war politics. The cable made its way through military channels and landed on the desk of Secretary of War Robert Patterson, who read it with a mixture of understanding and dread, knowing that any decision about Patton would ultimately have to be made by President Truman himself. Patterson carried the request to the White House, where Truman was already dealing with a cascade of post-war crises including labor strikes, economic reconversion, the beginning of atomic diplomacy with the Soviet Union, and growing pressure from Congress to bring all American servicemen home immediately regardless of strategic considerations. Truman had never served under Patton, had never met him personally, and knew him only through press reports and the complaints that regularly arrived from members of Congress whose constituents were outraged by Patton's statements and behavior. To Truman, Patton represented everything that was dangerous about giving military men too much independence, a brilliant tactician perhaps, but also a political liability who seemed incapable of understanding that, in a democracy, even generals must answer to civilian authority and public opinion. When Patterson presented Eisenhower's request, Truman's initial reaction was one of incredulity, asking whether Eisenhower had lost his mind to think that restoring Patton to a position of authority was even remotely feasible given the political climate and the public statements Patton had made comparing Nazis to ordinary American citizens. Truman had deep respect for Eisenhower, whom he regarded as one of the great military leaders of the age and a man of sound political judgment, but he also wondered whether Eisenhower's personal loyalty to Patton was clouding his strategic vision. Truman called a meeting with his closest advisers, including Patterson, Secretary of State James Burns, and Admiral William Leahy, his Chief of Staff, to discuss the Patton question and its broader implications for civil-military relations in the post-war period. The conversation in the Oval Office that November afternoon was intense and revealing, with Patterson arguing that Eisenhower's concerns about Soviet intentions were legitimate and that having Patton available as a contingency made military sense, while Burns countered that restoring Patton would be interpreted internationally as a signal that America was preparing for war with the Soviet Union and would destroy the fragile diplomatic framework that the State Department was trying to build. Leahy, a crusty naval officer who had served as Chief of Staff to Franklin Roosevelt and stayed on under Truman, offered a characteristically blunt assessment. Patton was a magnificent bastard in war but a dangerous fool in peace, and the United States had no business elevating such men when the goal was to build a peaceful international order based on law and cooperation, not military force. Right now, At this crucial midpoint in our story where Truman must decide between military effectiveness and political responsibility, we want to ask you to subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Smash that like button to help this content reach more people who care about history and leadership. Share this video with friends, family, or colleagues who need to hear about how difficult decisions get made at the highest levels of power. And leave a comment below telling us whether you think Truman made the right choice or whether Eisenhower's strategic concerns should have taken priority. Because your perspective matters and helps build our community of history enthusiasts. Truman listened to his advisors debate the merits and risks of the Patton question, but he had already made up his mind based on a principle that went to the core of his understanding of American democracy, which was that civilian authority must always remain supreme over military authority, and that no general, regardless of his talents or achievements, could be allowed to dictate policy or behave as though he were above the laws and norms that governed everyone else. Truman had studied history extensively despite never having attended college, and he knew that republics fell when military men became more powerful than elected officials, when generals started making political decisions, or when civilian leaders became too afraid or too weak to discipline military commanders who overstepped their bounds. In Truman's view, Patton had not just made a few unfortunate comments, he had fundamentally challenged the basis of American occupation policy and had done so in a way that suggested he believed his military rank entitled him to ignore directives from Washington and substitute his own judgment for that of elected officials. Truman drafted his response to Eisenhower personally, without delegating the task to staff, because he understood that this was a defining moment that would establish the boundaries of acceptable conduct for military commanders in the post-war era. The message Truman sent back to Frankfurt was polite but unambiguous. He thanked Eisenhower for his recommendation and acknowledged the Supreme Commander's concerns about the strategic situation in Europe, but he made clear that Patton would not be restored to any position of significant authority and that his current assignment would remain unchanged. More significantly, Truman's message included language that left no doubt about his reasoning. He wrote that the United States had just fought a war to defeat totalitarianism and to establish the principle that governments derive their authority from the consent of the governed, not from military force, and that American military commanders must exemplify these democratic values in their conduct and their public statements, not undermine them. Truman went on to say that Patton's comments about denazification and his administration of Bavaria had violated this fundamental principle and had damaged America's credibility as a liberating force committed to justice and democratic renewal, making it impossible to entrust him with responsibilities that required political sensitivity and diplomatic skill. The president concluded by expressing confidence in Eisenhower's ability to manage the European theater with the commanders currently available to him, and he suggested that if the strategic situation deteriorated to the point where additional military capabilities were needed, the solution would be to increase force levels and resources, not to rehabilitate commanders who had proven themselves incapable of operating within the constraints that democratic governance required. Eisenhower received Truman's message on December 3, 1945, and though he had expected the president to deny his request, the firmness of Truman's language and the explicit critique of Patton's conduct made clear that this was not simply a political calculation but a statement of principle that would define civil-military relations going forward. Eisenhower called Patton to his headquarters to deliver the news personally, and the meeting between the two men was painful for both of them, with Patton asking bitterly whether his 36 years of military service and his victories in North Africa, Sicily, France, and Germany counted for nothing in the eyes of politicians who had never heard a shot fired in anger. Eisenhower replied that Patton's military achievements would never be forgotten and would secure his place in history, but that the war was over and the rules had changed, and that in peacetime, military commanders had to operate within political constraints whether they liked those constraints or not. Patton left the meeting knowing that his career was effectively finished, and in the weeks that followed, he grew increasingly depressed and reckless, driving his staff car at dangerous speeds on icy German roads and talking openly about wanting to die in some manner more fitting to a soldier than fading away in an office job writing histories of battles he wished he could still be fighting. On December 9, 1945, just 6 days after Eisenhower received Truman's final decision on his future, Patton was riding in his staff car near Mannheim, Germany, when the vehicle collided with an American Army truck at an intersection, and though the accident was relatively minor and no one else was seriously injured, Patton suffered a broken neck that left him paralyzed from the neck down. Patton was rushed to a military hospital in Heidelberg where doctors worked frantically to save his life, but the damage to his spinal cord was catastrophic and beyond the medical capabilities of 1945 to repair. For 12 days, Patton lay in his hospital bed, fully conscious but unable to move, receiving visitors including Eisenhower and his wife Beatrice, who had rushed to Germany from the United States to be at his side, and in those final days, Patton seemed to achieve a kind of peace with his fate. telling Beatrice that it was perhaps appropriate that he should die now rather than live into a world where his kind of soldiering was no longer needed or wanted. On December 21, 1945, 12 days after the accident and 18 days after Truman's final rejection of Eisenhower's request to restore him to command, George S. Patton Jr. died from a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot that traveled to his lungs and stopped his heart, ending the life of one of the most controversial and effective military commanders America had ever produced. The news of Patton's death reached Washington on a cold December evening, and Truman, who had never met the man and who had just weeks earlier refused to grant him the professional resurrection he sought, wrote a letter of condolence to Beatrice Patton praising her husband's military achievements and his service to the nation, carefully avoiding any reference to the political conflicts that had defined the final months of Patton's life. Eisenhower, who had saved Patton's career after the slapping incidents in 1943 and who had tried one last time to save it in 1945, delivered the eulogy at Patton's funeral, speaking of his friend's genius, his courage, and his complexity, while carefully not mentioning the political battles or the question of whether Patton's talents might have been needed in the emerging Cold War that would dominate the next 4 decades of American strategic thinking.